Good morning. I'm glad you are here. Thank you for making your presence known by being present. So you don't need to make your presence known by having your cell phone go off during this time. So if you would check. So when you leave here today and you go back out that door, you can say thank you to Joshua and to Corbin. For those of you who are watching online, welcome. I'm glad that you are here, and thank you for John and Tim and all you do to make this happen in here so we can hear each other. Yes. So we begin in silence in here just to affirm our intention, which is another word for practice, of calling to mind who we truly are, and to allow that reality to come alive in us so that we can express it in the world when we leave here. So be present. And may grace be in our heads and in our thinking. May grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in my mouth and in my speaking. And may grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be in our in and at our departing. And may we come to know who we truly are. And may all creation benefit from what we do here. Amen. And no matter who you are, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. Okay, I got 2 goals today in teaching. The first is that I want to finish speaking before you finish listening. By the way, I want to say we're getting full. So that means full here. No matter where you are in the country or in the world, I guess, if you register, you'll get a link for the Saturday evening event right before it happens. So register for this. It'll be a good time. So again, I want to finish before you quit listening. We have enough born-again Christians. And we live in a time really when keen awareness and alertness is required for us out there to pay attention. And it's kind of an ambivalent thing because to protect your sanity, you need to unplug, but somehow you need to pay attention too. I picked this thing, the Wayless Way, from the teachings of Meister Eckhart. I had heard about Meister Eckhart when I was in seminary, but I didn't really take to that. I think my first real exposure to Meister Eckhart was in a conference that I attended at the CAC called Following the Mystics Through the Narrow Gates. And a man I've come to love very much taught at that conference, Jim Finley. And if you want to, you could go on to the website for the Center for Action and Contemplation and get that entire experience as a download now. I don't think they do CDs anymore, do they? Thing of the past. Meister Eckhart, that's not his real name. His real name was Eckhart von Hochem, and he was born around 1260. Not anybody for sure. He was of the Dominican order. And in the 19th century, he was recognized as one of the great saints of the Christian tradition. The term Meister came about sometime in the early part of the 14th century when he was asked to fill a teaching position in Paris that had only been held by two people, him and Thomas Aquinas. And so the students in Paris called him Mr. or Master, and that title just stuck to Meister Eckhart. And he is the one who talks over and over about the wayless way. And he also talked about the importance of unknowing and unlearning in order to be on the wayless way. So we have all been taught things that are either inaccurate or that are no longer useful. And especially when it comes to the two things that you cannot really talk about in church, politics and religion. We think that we know so much, and we can be so sure about the positions that we hold. At least I can. And then I encounter, particularly through people like Meister Eckhart, new understandings of Jesus who say, if you want to come and follow me, you got to let stuff go. Give up your jobs, give up your family, give up your income, whatever it is, and come. And learning to be that vulnerable is very difficult for most of us. So listen to these words from Eckhart. The soul that continues to cling to places, things, and people is withdrawing from God. And the more that it clings, feeling the world's comfort and pleasure, the more wretched it becomes. So I'm using for a guide for this journey that is no journey, the most recent scholarship that we have about Jesus, about who he was and about what he taught. And though I'm using the words journey and walking the way, I also want to keep before us Eckhart's insistence that you cannot get to a place where you already are. We can become aware of that place, but there's no place to get to. There's just a place to realize. Now, one of the reasons that some people are shocked or surprised by some of the things I teach in here is that the ongoing scholarship that I'm relying on, information and knowledge about Jesus and related matters, have not been taught in mainline Christian education for decades. So, with regard to that, I want to play for you a very brief video that actually several people have sent me. You may or may not have seen. It's very brief, so watch the monitors and pay attention. It will also be subcaptioned.
It's a metaphor for a mystery that absolutely transcends all categories of human thought, including being and non-being, but that's too many words for the back of a quarter. That's Joseph Campbell. I got all the best teachers later in life. Like Barry Taylor, the road manager for AC/DC, said, God is the name of the blanket we put over the mystery to give it a shape. Shouldn't I have learned that in church? Why am I learning this from Barry Taylor, the road manager for AC/DC?
You can watch his whole stand-up shtick on Netflix. Be forewarned, it gets pretty raunchy. Yeah, Pete Holmes, yeah. And I just found out from John when we were talking about this clip, he's quite an anomaly. He frequently mentions in his material his conviction and belief about the sacred and God, and he's clearly really smart. But he's also kind of filthy. But he takes issue with people about not believing, not being believers. And he's got a bit in this very piece about people who say that they don't believe in God, they're atheists. You got to see it. Or maybe you don't. I don't know. I'll tell you about it sometime. So what I'm talking about today is what happened after Jesus died and before really, I'm going to say, the 2nd century. And I'm not talking about what happened when the movement got taken by Constantine. I'm talking about something early. And I think it's really important that people know this material. And it may feel like that you are attending today a graduate level seminar in religious history. But I really think you'll know this. And then it will be my job to try to make this be relevant for our situation to know. I began this theme around the time of the presidential election, in case you don't remember that we had one, which was actually pure coincidence, because I wanted to begin with the birth narratives that we have of Jesus, and this coincided with the days in the northern hemisphere where the days were getting shorter and the night darkness was getting longer. And it also coincided with Advent in the Christian liturgical calendar. So to condense those teachings about the birth narratives into absurdly concise sentences, I said that the birth narratives are overtures. I got that word from Marcus Borg. Overtures, because if you get the birth narratives, you get everything that comes later. Now, there is an exception to that, which I'm going to do next Sunday in an experience that did not happen historically, but really also is a condensation of much that follows in the Jesus story, and that's the temptation experiences of Jesus. Also very relevant for us. So I said about those birth stories that they conveyed to us 4 things. That we need to be open, not defended. That we need to conceive something new. That we need to be impregnated with it. And then that we need to give birth to it. And we could spend hours talking about any one of those 4 things. So teaching about Jesus is difficult. For one reason, the subject is just a turnoff for a lot of people. Because of what Christian nationalism has done in bastardizing the Jesus movement. And just the word Christian, for many people, conjures up judgment and negativity and hypocritical and anti-gay and all that sort of stuff. Just hateful, unpleasant people. When we were meeting in the sacristy, what we call the sacristy meeting, but we don't meet in the sacristy actually. But Brandy, Brandy is a great preacher, preached today, said that she had difficulty in getting into today's gospel reading because she wanted to preach out of that gospel reading, but didn't want to sound mean. And I said, why not? That seems to be the ethos in our culture. Meanness. But if it had not been for Jesus, you wouldn't be here today. I don't mean to say that you were motivated to come here to hear about Jesus. As I said, a lot of people are staying away from churches because of stuff. I mean, had it not been for Jesus, this building, along with the specific mission and vision of St. Paul's, would not exist. Jesus started a movement a couple of centuries ago, and this is one of the expressions of that movement. Now, you may have come here because of your personal involvement with St. Paul's, but a lot of people who come to Ordinary Life don't go across the plaza and attend a worship service. This is your church. That's great. We don't have a formal membership in Ordinary Life. My belief is that if you're here, you're a member. But I grew up in a time and culture where going to church on Sunday was just a thing people did. When a family would move to a new community or a new town, one of the first things they did was find a church to join. And it usually was around denominational lines, but not always. It might have been the church that was closest to their home or one they heard about that had a good program for their kids. Going to church in my youth was the Facebook of the day. It was the Instagram of the way. It was the way that you kept up with what was going on in the community. And you could get a good tuna casserole from time to time. So whatever your reason for being here, Jesus is a figure to be reckoned with. More books have been written about Jesus than any other historical figure. More books written about Jesus than Napoleon, Shakespeare, Lincoln, Churchill combined. The problem is that scholars don't agree on very much about Jesus. Jesus was a first century Jew from Galilee. His mother was named Mary. He taught in parables, is said to have worked miracles. Others at the time did as well. He was crucified in Jerusalem. That's it. All the rest that we have about Jesus are theories, or they are beliefs created, which we'll talk about in a minute, out of people's experience and said to be facts. Many of the theories that have been cooked up about Jesus, I think, would make him sick at his stomach. So the Jesus movement started in Jerusalem, but because of what was going on in the Roman Empire and because of Paul, the movement fled or moved into the Hellenistic world. This is why the writings that we have about Jesus are in Greek, not in Aramaic, which was the language that he spoke. So right after the death of Jesus, there was a fairly well-organized Jesus movement. We now know that the way that it manifested itself from place to place varied greatly. There was no uniformity, but there was a Jesus movement that grew up. And these people told stories about Jesus, which eventually were collected and eventually written down and eventually put into narratives that became gospels that we have. Now, people who insist on an inerrant Bible run into the first of the thousands of difficulties they have here, because if there were gospels written in Palestine prior to 70, we don't have them. Eyewitnesses were killed. So the only data that we have about Jesus comes from oral tradition. And as I said, the matter is made more difficult because these stories had to make it from the Jewish world to the Greek world. The first gospel that we have is the Gospel of Mark, which was put together at least 40 years after the death of Jesus by someone who did not know Jesus personally and who lived outside of Palestine. Now, because of this, and as well as a variety of other valid reasons, scholars are all over the map when they try to determine who Jesus was and what he said and did. I see Jesus as a Jewish mystic in the prophetic tradition of his own religion. This is my position. It is not the only one that someone could have. Others see Jesus as a holy man who heals people with speech and touch. There were other healers as well at the time. Some see Jesus as strictly a wisdom teacher, And others emphasize his role as a prophet, like Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel. And then there are those who portray Jesus as a zealous revolutionary who continued in his own way the unique work of John the Baptist. And they say Jesus was swept up in the turmoil of first century Palestine. Now, these are not minor differences. And my point to bring this up is to say that among respected scholarship, there's no real consensus about who the Jesus of history was. Now, you understand, I'm talking about Jesus. I'm not talking about Christ. That's different. I'm talking about Jesus as a historical figure. We'll get to Christ sometime later. So we covered in a great deal of detail these birth parables about Jesus. They were created about Jesus, and they could not be more different. They cannot be reconciled. They tell quite different but very compelling stories. And there are some fanciful stories told about Jesus, and these have been collected and we have them available for us. Jesus, when he was a little boy, made some clay birds and made them turn live, and they flew away. That's a story about Jesus in his youth. One time he got irritated with a playmate and hit him and killed him, and then brought him back to life. That's a written story about Jesus in the material. But we really don't know anything about Jesus until his encounter with John the Baptist. There is a story told about Jesus being around 12. And he goes to Jerusalem with Mary and Joseph, and after the Passover festival is over and this whole contingent leave Jerusalem and head back to Nazareth, about 3 days out, they realize that Jesus is not with them. So Mary and Joseph, being the good parents that they are, decide to go back and look for Jesus, and they find him in the temple, confounding the rabbis with his wisdom. It's a painting by Rembrandt. And so his parents chewed him out and told him never to do something like that again, and took him home, and he was not allowed to watch any TV for a week. And that at the end of this story, all that it says in the gospel that has this is that Jesus grew in stature and wisdom. That's it. The scholars hypothesize that actually it was probably around 12 or 13 when Jesus left home. That was what young boys did at that time. Apprenticed himself to a tradesperson, or in the case of Jesus, probably apprenticed himself to John the Baptist. No one knows. Now, John the Baptist is described as a wild, crazy guy. Like Steve Martin, I guess, who said the end of the world is coming, by which he meant not the end of the world, he meant the end of the Roman Empire. And people better get their acts together because God is going to come and take over. And to indicate that was happening, people went to John and they were baptized in the Jordan River. Now, when I first saw this painting by Da Vinci, I said to myself, that's wrong, because I'm a Baptist. And any good Baptist knows you don't baptize by pouring water on people. You stick them underwater, which is what the Jews did. It's the way of purification in the temple. So when John the Baptist's followers went to John and got in the Jordan, baptism was not a one-time dunking underwater. It was more akin to a drumming ritual. People would get into waist or chest deep water and immerse themselves over and over and over and over, and thereby they would get into some altered state of consciousness by doing this. It was that kind of ecstatic ritual, which we have made into something other. I think it's a pretty good ritual, actually. So I want to spend some time today talking about what happened to Jesus' message just a few years after his death. Now, his disciples did experience that there was energy alive within and around them. They referred to it as a resurrection. And we're going to postpone dealing with the resurrection for a while. But they did experience new life, and it manifested itself in the way that they got together and shared food and belongings and joy and forgiveness and hope with each other. This is relevant for our time. About how you can't do this by yourself, this going forward. This is a we endeavor. But we live in such an atomistic, granulated culture where everything is focused on this. We're so isolated that we don't make connection with one another very often. So we live in a time, just like those early followers of Jesus did, when his message got hijacked and corrupted and given the growth and apparent power of a Christian nationalist movement. Though, just to be clear, there is nothing Christian about it. Many people in our culture, you might consider yourself one of them, are experiencing some form of exile, either from their religion or from their country. Another way that we can identify with what was going on with these early people. Now, however else these scholars that I mentioned earlier describe Jesus, one of the things that people cannot evade is that Jesus was a Jew. And the Jews believed in one God that made them the first monotheistic religion. And Jews believed that God, the creator of the universe, had chosen Israel from among all the nations of the world to do God's will. God's will was conveyed to the Jewish people through the law, given, according to the story, to Moses on Mount Sinai. So God had made a covenant with the Jews. And if they would keep this covenant, God would protect them. And the Jews believed that the two most important laws to enact and give life to is that they are to love God with all that they are. With all your heart, by the way, means daily spiritual practice. I know, you get tired of hearing that, but that is what it means. It doesn't mean just going, ooh. That's not what that means. And to love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus was this religious reformer about this. And he stressed the inner meaning of the law. He wasn't for the letter of the law, so he wouldn't support putting the Ten Commandments on the wall of public classrooms. Because he was one of those Jews who believed in the prophetic tradition that the law should be written on your heart. It was an inner thing that showed out manifestly. And probably there is no better depiction of the love and compassion that Jesus taught about God than in the story he told that we know as the parable of the prodigal son. Actually, the word prodigal means recklessly extravagant. So this is really the story of the prodigal father. The father is prodigal in his love for the son. So this is one of the major ways that Jesus differed from the prevailing Jewish theology and emphasis of his day. Now, the major emphasis of Jesus' ministry, and we do not have a good English translation for this. It's the phrase that gets translated kingdom of God. Scholars debate about what this kingdom or rule meant, but nobody will deny this was Jesus' central focus. The kingdom is not something Jesus taught that is taken by force. God brings the kingdom. Again, that is relevant for our culture. Jesus taught that the kingdom was for Jewish people, and he taught that his followers should pray for it to come. And we do that every time we offer the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come. Your will be done on earth, not somewhere else. And you notice that Jesus never said, pray for the second coming. God is going, according to Jesus, God is going to bring in this new rule that will replace political power in the managing of human affairs. Take note. So Jesus shows people how to live in this kingdom by teaching that these events are going to take place in the first century. In Matthew, Luke, and Mark, Jesus clearly says, quote, I tell you solemnly, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power. That didn't happen. Now, Jesus said the kingdom's work is going to be seen, and then he told parables about what it looked like. And we're still trying to figure out some of these parables, what they mean. And we will be delving into them in the weeks and months ahead. The only thing I would say now is that when people are taken over by this kingdom, or they decide to live its values ahead of it being established, they demonstrate a new quality of life. Jesus said that one would be able to tell who these people are by their fruits. That is, by the way that they lived. And the fruits Jesus had in mind were love of neighbors, treating others justly, giving to the poor, being peacemakers, forgiving, showing mercy. Compare that with what's going on in our culture. None of this sounds like what I understand to be the thrust of Christian nationalism, which seems to be angry, threatening, accusatory, and controlling. Now, in the New Testament, the Gospel of John is not considered by most scholars to be a narrative. So if you set the Gospel of John aside and just go with Matthew, Luke, and Mark, you never see a Jesus who says about himself, I am divine. Now, this is a condensed description of Jesus before he was crucified. And perhaps what I have sketched out is what Christianity would have looked like if two things had not happened. Had it not been for Paul, and if in the 60s Jerusalem were not overtaken and the temple had been destroyed and the Jews were sent on a dispersion into the Greco-Roman world. So to put it succinctly, because of Paul and the historical circumstances, the message of Jesus got hijacked, and a new religion based on beliefs rather than behavior got created. And as influential as it has been, and we continue it being influential, we read from Paul almost every Sunday in our liturgy. that had no connection with the teachings of Jesus. I want to repeat that and let it sink in. The God-centered religion of Jesus was replaced with a religion in which Jesus became the center. And this is what most people think Christianity is. Paul called Saul before lightning struck here a few weeks ago. If you weren't here, you missed an event. Paul was struck with a religious experience on the road to Damascus. Paul never personally knew Jesus. He knew about Jesus. He knew about Jesus' followers because he himself said that he had persecuted them. So the experience that Paul had was one of deep, transformative love. There's no doubt about that. He felt that he had been united with a God of love that he had never known before. And consequently, the religion of Jesus, in which you did good works to bring in the kingdom, was replaced with faith in Jesus to do for you what God had done for Paul. That's a big shift. Very important. So the God-centered religion of Jesus got replaced. And Paul believed that the essence of the Jesus movement was love, and that the only rule of love, the only ethical rule was love. And according to Paul, if one were in Christ, which is a favorite phrase of Paul, in Christos is used over and over and over and over in the writings of Paul. If you are in Christ, then the love of God will overtake your personality. Not a bad theology. It's not what Jesus taught, but it's not a bad theology. So Paul is the one who planted the notion, he planted the seeds for what in the 14th century would become the theory of substitutionary atonement, and that is that God died for your sins, which is clearly contraindicated by the historical evidence that Jesus died because he was a threat to the political establishment. More specifically, he was a threat to the religiously elite, and they didn't want him messing with their stuff, so they engineered to get him out of the way. It didn't work. So Paul's theology took the focus off of the nation Israel and put it sadly on the individual. Those who believed would be saved. And if the kingdom isn't here now, don't worry, you'll be taken up into heaven. That's a pretty simple formula. Just believe in Jesus and everything will be okay. It's the theology I grew up with. It's immensely popular among some people. And the gift of life is such a great selling point, and Paul was such a great marketer, that this propelled the movement to become the world's leading religion, if you measure religion by number of adherents. So Paul took the human Jesus and made him into a divine being. Now there were elaborations on what I'm saying over the years and fights. The early Jesus movement had fights with the Jews that they came from. They wanted the movement to stay in Judaism. The Gentile adherents and Paul, including Paul, and some Jewish people in the synagogues didn't want that, so there was a split. The Gospel of John is a reflection of that. Very painful. When a church splits, it's very painful. So then the early Jesus followers were not only persecuted and ostracized by the Jews, they were ridiculed and persecuted by the Roman authorities because they refused to just add God to the pantheon of gods that Rome wanted. And then the Jesus followers fought among themselves, which we are still doing, for all the reasons that humans have been at odds with each other. As a religion, Christianity wins the prize for being able to split into factions. Now, you have some major divisions in Judaism, Orthodox, Reform, so forth. You have some divisions in Islam. But boy, and you have some divisions in Catholicism, mostly geographical. But boy, when it comes to Protestants, you know there are almost 200 different kinds of Baptists. I'm serious. 200 different Baptist denominations in the world. And of course, most recently, the stable, staid United Methodist Church split along MAGA lines, by the way, not theological. And a conflict exists right now in the present moment called Christian nationalism, which seems to be being pretty successful in using a wrecking ball on ideas and institutions and programs. So if you ever look at what's going on in the church or in the world and say, how in the world do we end up here? One of the answers to that question is that we made a shift between behavior to beliefs. And that's killing us to this very moment. What are your political beliefs, or your economic beliefs, your educational beliefs, your regional beliefs, whatever they are, they're killing us. Now, if you're still listening, I have accomplished my first goal because I'm done with that part. So how about making it relevant, although I've tried to make some asides all along the way? I don't know where you get your news about what's going on in the world. I've tried to unplug as much as possible, but it is impossible in this culture not to be exposed to some of what's happening. Here's something you might find interesting. The World Economic Forum, whose stated goal is to bring together government, businesses, and civil society to improve the state of the world, has said for the second year in a row that the greatest risk to countries around the world over the next 2 years is misinformation and disinformation. Not physical illness, not a pandemic. It's misinformation and disinformation. That's the greatest threat. So false and misleading content is seriously harming the geopolitical environment in a variety of ways. It affects voters' intentions. It sows doubt about what's really happening around the world. It's being used to tarnish the image of other countries. And they say this is our biggest global risk. So talking about taking this Jesus material and putting it out there into practice or trying to apply it can feel very risky because it is political. I didn't say partisan. I just said it is political. Caring for the poor and the dispossessed, practicing justice are matters of politics. Now, I don't know about you, but I look at some of the mental and moral capacities as reflected in their behavior and beliefs of some of the people who are being put in positions of critical leadership in our country. And I'm appalled. I am appalled. Now, I know there are others who are delighted. I learned a long time ago in doing clinical psychotherapy that it is possible to find a support group for any idiotic position you want to hold. Seriously. There is a support group for pedophiles. I don't mean for people who are recovering from pedophiles, for people who practice it. It's there. The Code of Ethics of the American Psychological Association, and I think this applies to other licensed healthcare professionals as well, obligates the healthcare professional to intervene in some way when someone is of danger to themselves or others. It's called duty to warn. Otherwise, the professional is seen as derelict in their duty and responsibility and can be held liable for a patient's behavior. Jesus was very clear that the kingdom people had a duty to speak out the truth and to care for others, especially for people who did not have the power or the resources to speak up for themselves. So if being Christian is to have, as Paul put it, the mind of Christ in us, that believes more than believing. And I know for sure that walking the wayless way is not a simple solution for positive thinking. So if that's what you're looking for, you won't find it with Jesus. If misinformation and disinformation is our greatest threat, it would probably be helpful to keep in mind that none of us is exempt from being affected by that. I quoted in here a couple of weeks ago, overhearing a conversation where a man said something, the other man said, "Where'd you learn that?" And he said, "On the news." And the response was, "What news?" Where do you get what you believe is true about what's going on? We got to keep our critical thinking faculties alert because there are things that are happening that are scary. And already news media are beginning to back off reporting what is going on for fear of reprisal. I'm keeping my eye on 2 lawsuits that are going on right now that have been filed by the administration against CBS and ABC. If those 2 entities waffle and cave, I think that's a big red flag. This is Martin Niemöller. Martin Niemöller was a prominent Lutheran pastor in Germany. And in the early 1920s and 30s, he was a Nazi sympathizer. There were many in the German church who were Nazi sympathizers. And there were many in the German church usually goes by the name of the confessional church, Lutheran confessional church, who kept their mouths shut. They knew what was going on, but they didn't say anything. But Niemöller was a sympathizer to the Nazis. But after Hitler came to power and Niemöller saw what was going on, he started speaking out. And because of that, he spent the last 8 years of Nazi rule in a concentration camp, lucky to escape with his life. And when he was released, he gave us talk, not immediately, but sometime after. And this is what he said in that talk. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Now, I speak out because I have a platform, and I try not to offend, try not to be partisan. So one of the ways that I speak out is by being ironic and by being cute. And being a smartass. So when I first heard weeks ago that there was a plan to rename the Gulf of Mexico, I just cringed. It has been the Gulf of Mexico for 240 years, and if you know anything about the history about how oceans are named, to name it the Gulf of America is a sign of weakness, not strength. If you know anything about the history of how bodies of water are named, not a good sign. But if you look on Google Maps, today it is the Gulf of America. And Apple Maps, it's the Gulf of America. So Dr. Holly Hudley and I talk almost every day, and we were talking, and I was telling her about this idea I had, so I'm grateful to Holly for being able to share this with you. We got to talking about the mnemonic. She remembered a different one than after we got off the phone I remembered, for remembering the planets. And my mnemonic is, my very easy method just speeds up naming planets. My very easy method just speeds up naming planets. So you have Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. You just wait, just hang on. I'm not through yet. So I thought, why stop with renaming bodies of water and mountains? So here we have our solar system with all the planets going out from the Earth, and you can see them: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus. Neptune is coming, Saturn, there's Neptune. And come on. There is Pluto right there. So we rename them now: Mercury, Venus, America. Why not? Isn't that the direction that we are heading? And you will notice that the Pluto has a questionable planetary status. Holly, thank you for your slide. So just from now on, say you live on America. It sounds ludicrous, doesn't it? So does so much else. So the man who bragged that he had never attended a performance at the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, and is the first president to refuse attending a Kennedy Center honors event, is now the chairman of the board of directors of the Kennedy Center. Go figure. It's enough to keep anybody off balance. So let's just name Earth America and get it over with. As I said, I don't know where you get your news. If you are interested in the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other approach, I could not more highly recommend Diana Butler Bass's The Cottage. This is the splash page, but I just got off the most recent. It changes every day. Diana Butler Bass has spoken and taught here. She's been here. She and I dialogue one Sunday. She's an amazing woman. And if you want to read something that is newsworthy and encouraging every day, this costs $60 a year to get. It's called The Cottage, and you can go online and get it. And she's really, really solid. Hers is a parachurch organization like Richard Orr's, so she's not at risk of being fired or offending a bunch of people by what she says, like I am, or it varies where you stand to speak in a religious organization. So my goal is I want to take Jesus as a model in a country and a world that seems to be coming apart at the seams. Now, I have a friend who is on the far right, who is in favor of everything that is happening. And he says, we're taking everything back to the studs. Yeah? Okay. So there are different points of view about this. I acknowledge that. I think one of the reasons I've come to love and appreciate the work of Meister Eckhart is because he talks about what it means to have faith living in the dark. I got to tell you, I do not pretend to be a reader of original Eckhart. I've tried, but it's so hard for me. So I'm really, really grateful for people like Jim Finley and other people who've been interpreters and teachers, and for a recent course that I took on Meister Eckhart. His writing is just, once you get it, it's just so beautiful. He writes, "So you wish to begin a new life. Then begin here and now with whatever you're doing. However dark and meaningless it may seem, for your work is to find God always and in all ways, at all times and all places, in any company and in all ways. This is the wayless way that leads to growth in everything and increase unceasingly without end." That's good theology. That's Jesus theology. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargo. Watch your step. See you here next week. Thank you.